Hi, my name is Yasmin Terehi. I recently completed my 2-month transformational leadership program, and the results were powerful. If you want to live an exciting life and fulfill your highest potential in 2023 and beyond, I have an incredible opportunity for only a few more individuals to join the next cohort. I will personally be coaching a small group on how to discover and clear your limiting beliefs, how to manage your energy instead of your time, how to tap into the power of your intuition, and how to use discernment so that you can start living a life full of ease, abundance, and flow. As someone who has helped countless entrepreneurs and CEOs open doors of possibility they never thought existed, I can tell you that this strategy will completely transform your life. Best part, you'll 10x your output and unlock your creative genius. I'll work with you weekly to overcome your limiting beliefs and transform that into a new self-concept. I'll teach you how to create clarity, systems, and processes, and I'll also help you develop your intuition. You'll get access to some of the best material that will also help you manage your energy, and you'll get access to guided meditations that are not available anywhere else. This method is so effective. If you'd like to join the waitlist, you can find the link in the show notes or navigate to www.yasminterehi.com/gateways-to-awakening/. Hi, my name is Yasmin Terehi, and this is Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, and spirituality. On today's episode, I sit down with Dr. Heidi Horsley. She's an international grief expert, licensed psychologist, and social worker. She's the executive director and co-founder of the Open to Hope Foundation, one of the largest internet grief resources with over 2 million yearly visitors. She also hosts the award-winning Open to Hope cable television show and podcast. Dr. Heidi is an adjunct professor at Columbia University, and she also serves on the National Board of Directors for the Compassionate Friends, the largest peer-to-peer support organization in the world. She also serves on the National Advisory Board for the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, TAPS, and she has such an incredible background. She's co-authored 8 books, including Spouse Loss, Inspirational Stories for Handling the Holidays After Loss, Real Men Do Cry, and so many more. I'll leave them in the show notes. But without further ado, Heidi, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Yasmin. I'm honored to be here.
So Heidi, to kick it off, I'd love to understand, what does it mean to grieve, and why do so many people misunderstand the purpose of grief?
Wow, that is a really difficult question. It's complicated. That's why it's a difficult question. So what does it mean to grieve? Grief comes in waves. So it doesn't come in nice, neat stages. And, we can be doing fine 1 minute, and then we can have a memory or an anniversary date or a song or something can come up, a reminder, and it can be overwhelming at times. So, you're kind of back and forth sometimes between living your life and being in that grief space.
Mm. And, I'm super curious, a lot of people I think are, don't understand the concept of grief and how long it takes and what the steps are. Can you talk to us about sort of the main steps or the process to the grief cycle, how long it lasts, and, what feels like an average amount of time to grieve for folks, and just, sort of walk us through that process?
Okay, again, that's complicated because oftentimes we are on our own journeys, and it'll take people different times, depending on things like how close were you to the person, how significant were they in your life, what was the relationship like. The first year, you're often in shock, you're numb, you're in disbelief. You can't believe this happened to you. The second year, permanence sets in, reality. This is my life. This person isn't coming back. I have to figure out who I am without them not physically present, because oftentimes they can be spiritually present, but they're not physically here anymore. The third year, things start to get a little more, you start to figure out, okay, wait, I'm starting to get my sea legs under me and starting to figure out who I am without this person. But it is a journey. It is a process. It takes a lot longer than most people realize. This is not something that happens in a year. We don't get over a loss. We learn to live with it. And closure, we don't have closure. Closure is for bank accounts, not love accounts. So we learn to find a new normal after someone has died that we love. We learn to go into our next chapter. We learn to reinvent ourselves. So it is a process, and it can last a lot longer than people realize.
What are sort of the symptoms that you noticed in the first year of a big loss, in terms of grief? Like how have you seen people process that in more of like a healthy way versus maybe an unhealthy way?
I think one of the healthiest things you can do after a loss is find community. Listen to podcasts like yours. Go online and find support groups through the Compassionate Friends, through TAPS. There's a lot of organizations out there that will support you after a loss. Get involved in them either virtually, because you can get involved virtually nowadays, or in person, and connect with people that have had significant losses in their lives. If we connect with people, we don't feel so alone. We don't feel like we're going crazy. It normalizes our experience. We don't feel like we're the only ones that have had this happen. So get support and try not to isolate. I think that's one of the biggest things I would say to people in the first year.
And you mentioned the Compassionate Friends Project. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. The Compassionate Friends is the largest peer-to-peer support group in the world for people that have had the death of a child, sibling, or grandchild. So that's what they do. And TAPS, which is another organization I'm involved with, helps people that have had a military loss in the United States. But the Compassionate Friends is international.
Wow. And we'll leave that in the show notes for folks. So Heidi, why does it feel like, at least in the West, I can say like, it feels like we're so unprepared for loss and for grief? And why do you think that is?
Well, one of the things I think is a problem in the West is that we don't have enough ritual. We've gotten rid of a lot of our rituals. We've medicalized death. Often people die in hospitals. People don't see the bodies. They're not at home. We don't have ritual. Some cultures and some religions have ritual, but many don't. Many people don't have that anymore. And I think that can be really, really difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm really curious, how do you help people process their grief and how do you work with people who have had a significant loss? Like, how would you kind of consult them or work with them?
Well, one of the main ways I work with them is I let them tell their story. We need to tell our stories. And, people say, well, I do tell my story to friends and, strangers. But the reality is people don't want to hear your entire story. Oftentimes people want to know how somebody died. And as soon as they find out, they don't want to hear anything else. We want to talk about how they lived. And we also want to talk about maybe the stories of how we are coping in depth. And we need people that are there to be able to hear those stories, to be able to hear what we're struggling with, to be able to hear what we're going through. And you need to tell your story sometimes in depth, because sometimes you have a lot of trauma. Depending on how somebody died, you can have a very traumatic loss. And if you've had a traumatic loss, you need to tell your story in depth to somebody that can hear it and process it with you.
Mm. Yeah, I've noticed, this might be anecdotal, but it feels like a lot of people are not equipped to handle kind of being on the receiving end of listening to stories about grief. It just, I just sort of noticed that whenever there's a moment where there is a loss, I feel like there's a lot of uncomfortableness. So how can, everyone really become more resilient in being able to hold space for people when it comes to also helping people process grief and tell their stories? Like, what would you tell folks like that?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I guess first of all, I want to say that I agree with you. I think people want to hear that you're fine. When they say, how are you doing? They want to hear that you're fine. And I'd also say that when people are grieving, we as grievers, I'm going to use myself, need to be good grief support. We need to let people know what we need, what we want, what we expect. Because, oftentimes people aren't coming out of a place of malice. They're coming because the reason they're not supportive is because they don't know what to do. They don't know what to say. And just going up to somebody and saying, "Hey, I have no idea what to say. I don't know what to do." That for me was really comforting after my dad and my brother died. Those things can be comforting. You don't have to have the right answers, but just to go up and say that. I think just showing up for people that are grieving is a big one. Because when someone you've had a loss, oftentimes people disappear. They can't deal with it, and just being there and showing up is a lot. It's very helpful for people.
So, Heidi, what happens when we do not process our grief? Like, let's say we just don't feel comfortable talking about it, or we don't have the right spaces and places. Like, what have you noticed happens to people when they don't actually deal with their grief?
Well, sometimes we're in a place where we can't deal with it. We might be overwhelmed in our lives, or we might have multiple losses if we live in places where there's things happening, war zones, et cetera, where there's multiple losses, wherever it might be. And sometimes we have to put it on a shelf, and sometimes that can be adaptive. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're grieving in a maladaptive way if you're not dealing with it. Sometimes we have to put it away and then visit it in places where we can. But what may happen is if you don't deal with it, it may start to, you may start to think about it over and over and over in your head. And it also may keep you from, investing in new relationships. You may be afraid to invest in a new relationship because you're afraid that person will die. If you're angry about how somebody died or what happened, you may take that anger out on other people in your life. So being with safe people where you can explore what's happened and you can talk about what's happened is really healthy. And then you won't project negative feelings onto other people. It can also be hard on your health if you hold everything in and don't tell anybody what's going on. It can cause health problems.
Wow. And, you mentioned that your brother and your father passed away. Can you tell us why you chose to work in this specific field and what it has meant to you?
Sure. So that's pretty much the heart of my life. This is what I do. Everything I do in basically my brother's memory. And when I was 20 years old, my 17-year-old brother and cousin were riding in a car. My cousin was driving, and the car hydroplaned, hit the side of a bridge, and it blew up. And both Matthew and Scott, my brother and my cousin, were 17, and they died very suddenly and extremely traumatically. And that I was 20 at the time, and that death turned my world upside down. And I know a lot of people that are listening right now have had this experience where everything that they've ever believed in was put into question. Who am I without my brother? Who was I? I didn't know who I was. I lost not only my brother, but my identity. He was my go-to person. He was my everything. He was my best friend. He was just, meant the world to me. And when he died, it just put everything I ever believed into question. I was like, who am I? The pain was so great. Not only did I not know if I was going to survive, I really didn't know if I wanted to, honestly, because the pain was that great. I ended up going on a survival program for a month. It was called Outward Bound. And when I went on it, my father gave me a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And for those of you that don't know, sometimes we're given books in our lives right at the time that we really need them. It's interesting, right? It's like we're given this book and we're like, I needed this. Okay, so in this book, it is a man who goes, who's in the Holocaust, and his whole family is killed along with his pregnant wife and all of his friends. They all die. And so it's his story. Viktor Frankl is his name. And it is his story about how he not only survives losing all his family and friends, but he ends up eventually thriving. And he quotes Nietzsche as saying, "He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how." We have to know why we're here. What is our purpose? What gives us meaning? And part of why we're here, to be honest with you, is to keep the memory of the people that we love that have died, their memories alive. That's part of our purpose in life. So I knew I had to figure out why I was here. And my other takeaway from that book was, if Viktor Frankl can survive and thrive after his entire family dies, then I am going to be able to survive and eventually thrive after my brother and cousin die. Because we don't just want to survive. We want to thrive. We want to find meaning again. And I had lost my meaning. So it was a journey. I took an existential journey, which lasted 3 years. For some it's more, for some it's less. There are no time frames on this. And when I came out of this, I dropped out of college, moved away. And when I came out of this 3-year journey, I was working at that point, but I decided I want to go into the field of psychology and social work and help people find hope again. I want to give them the support that I didn't feel that I had. So that's kind of what I've devoted my life to. And my brother is my guiding light. He is my guiding light every step of the way.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that story.
Yeah,
Wow.
you're welcome.
Very, very emotional and moving. And you also mentioned your father. So I'm curious,
Yes.
now that, you had that experience and that you dedicated your life to this, how did you deal with your father's death differently?
Well, it was different because my father he died 2 years ago during COVID. And that was very, very difficult because he was in the hospital for back surgery and got a staph infection, and I was not allowed to see him. So my brother died suddenly, so I didn't see him. But my father, I knew he was declining in the hospital, but I wasn't allowed to see him. So that part of it was very isolating and hard because I wasn't able to say goodbye, and I knew that he was dying. It was a little different because he had lived a full life and a long life. But I want to say for people out there, just because someone dies and they're older, because he was in his early 80s, doesn't mean we don't miss them. I'd never known my life without my father. He was the first man I ever loved. Everything I did was to make him proud. So his loss was very different than my brother's, but it was as significant. Because sometimes I think we can minimize these things and minimize the fact that people that are older die, and maybe that it maybe is not as significant, but all losses are significant for different reasons.
Ooh, yeah. And, it's interesting because I think I've heard a lot of stories of, folks who died during COVID and, weren't able to see families, and just, curious, what that impact has done on the collective psyche, like what you've kind of noticed when, especially coming out of the pandemic, like how has your practice and perspective shifted since we had the pandemic?
Well, I think people are talking more openly about grief and loss because there were so many people that died during the pandemic. So I think as a collective, it's a conversation that is happening more often. You're seeing shows like this, podcasts like with these kind of themes in it more than we ever have. So I think that part is positive, that we're talking about it, that we're supporting each other, that we're having these conversations. I think it was very difficult for anyone that couldn't see people that they loved at the end. If you know someone is dying and you can't see them because there's unfinished business that you're not able to finish if you could have seen them. So that can be very difficult.
And Heidi, do you suggest that people create like their own kind of closing ceremony or ritual if they did not have access to someone who died? Like how would you kind of help folks, who can close that chapter or who didn't get a chance to? And I'm also curious how that works for folks in a war zone.
Yasmin, I love this. These are such good questions. Yes, I think you can do it anywhere. You can do it in a war zone or not in a war zone. I think writing letters to somebody, you don't have to send them. You can rip them up. You can burn them in a ritual. You can mail them, to nobody. You can mail them to your loved one. I mean, so I think writing letters is really great. I think having conversations with that person, because we've internalized their messages. Yes, Scott and my father died. I know what they would say to me. I know the kind of advice they would give to me. So having conversations in my office, I do it's called the Gestalt theory, where I do the empty chair technique. And I say, what if your mom was here right now, or your dad or your brother and sitting in that chair? What would they say to you? What do you want to say to them? What unfinished business do you have? When people are having a hard time, I say, what would your loved one say to you right now if they were here? What advice would they give you? What support would they give you? So, we can continue those conversations even after people are physically gone.
Yes. Thank you so much. Those are all really, really great things to do for folks who may be stuck or don't know what to do next. I'm also curious, Heidi, if you could talk to us a little bit about what Open to Hope is.
Sure. So the Open to Hope Foundation is something that my mom and I founded. And we did it. It's an online free resource internationally. All you need is the internet. And it's for people that are looking for hope after loss. And the reason we called it Open to Hope is because we didn't want to tell people to have hope after loss, because that is minimizing a loss. That is invalidating it. I would have been really angry if someone had told me to have hope. But if someone had told me to be open to the idea that maybe someday you can have hope, I would have been open to that. So our message is just to be open to the idea that someday you may have hope again, even though right now you don't believe that. And we close every show by saying, if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own. Because sometimes we have to lean on people that are further down the road in their journey, in their grief journey. We have to lean on their hope until we find our own. So we have hundreds of cable shows and podcasts and authors writing for us. We have 400 authors that have written for us. And we've been doing this for almost 20 years. So we have a lot of content for people so that you don't feel alone. You can listen 24 hours a day. I know someone that was in Afghanistan, and he listened every night for 3 years.
Wow.
So you can listen wherever you are.
Wow. Amazing. That's such an incredible resource. So we'll also leave the link to that in the show notes for people to have access to it. So Heidi, I'd love to understand some of the trends you may have noticed or seen over time, working with men versus women, or working with, Western cultures or Eastern cultures when it comes to processing grief. Like, have you noticed any kind of trends come up or emerge from these nuances and differences, and how these just, groups can actually learn from each other?
Well, I'm going to be stereotypical when I do the men versus women.
Okay.
Because there are exceptions. There are people that aren't like this. I think that we're changing so that we're not as different as we used to be. But I think traditionally, men seem to be better at grieving shoulder to shoulder rather than looking at people in the eye. I think they like to be doing things. I always say, if you want to have conversations with teenagers or boys, male teenagers or male boys, like, be doing something with them. I think that men, especially in the Western culture and all over the world, but have been given messages like walk it off, suck it up, big boys don't cry, be a man, hide your emotions. And those are not healthy messages. They can be very toxic when you're grieving. So I think those can be difficult. As far as Western versus Eastern, I think sometimes in Eastern cultures, they do a better job with ritual, around grief and loss. So
yeah, fascinating. I've noticed that trend as well. With men, it just feels like now there's a movement towards being much more open in their emotional world rather than just holding it in. And just wanted to highlight that because I just think we need to talk about it in our culture and ensure that these spaces, that there are open spaces for it, rather than it being bottled up.
Absolutely. And in fact, on a side note, I wrote a book called Real Men Do Cry, and it was with an NFL football quarterback. So he was a professional football quarterback for 10 years for the Detroit Lions. And he talks about the fact that the message he was given were not helpful when his teenage son killed himself. It wasn't helpful for him to hide his emotion and not seek help. He needed the support of other people. He needed to reach out. And that's why he wrote the book with me, so that he could help other men, go through the journey of grief.
And so, Heidi, the best thing we can do if someone is going through a loss or grief is to just let them tell their story. Don't interject. Don't try to be helpful, essentially. Just really hold space for them. That's really what they want, is to be validated. Is that correct?
Well, yes. And if you're going to be helpful, don't have euphemisms like, at least it was fast, at least they were old, at least da-da-da. Anything that starts with at least is not helpful. So minimizing and acknowledging acknowledging and validating is helpful, but minimizing a loss is not helpful. You can, there's friends out there, and also look at friends in different ways. In other words, you're going to have friends out there that are not grief support, but maybe they're there to help you play and distract you. Maybe that's their role. So that could be their role, and that might be good for you. And then there's going to be friends that are great support. Everybody's not going to be great grief support. So, that's just not how everybody is. And then there's going to be other friends that, want to go and do things with you. So there's different friends for different reasons.
Yeah, definitely. So what sort of things have surprised you the most on this journey, Heidi?
Well, I've been surprised at the amazing people that I've met that have also had death, a loss in their lives. There's a depth to people that have had loss that I've never seen before. There are so many angels on this earth that have had, and when I say that, I mean people that have had losses that are here making meaning after their loss. There's something called post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic wisdom. And there's a lot of research out there on these things. And it talks about how we grow in profound ways after our losses. Now, that doesn't mean I wish my brother was here. I would rather have my brother here than grow in profound ways, but he's not. We have grown in profound ways. It shows that people that have had significant losses in their lives, they have more gratitude for being alive. They can support others who have gone through great adversity and loss. They're better equipped to go through great adversity and loss because other things might happen in their life. They're more spiritual. So there's a lot of takeaways and a lot of things that happen that are the areas that we grow in after a loss.
That's beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true for anytime I have an issue, I'm always going to people who have been through a lot of, experiences, who can actually have the perspective that could be helpful. So definitely agree. How, has your point of view evolved over time, Heidi? You've been in this world for so long. How have you sort of shifted your thinking, if at all, on this space?
One of the biggest shifts I've had is that I didn't realize 35 years after my brother died, and I did say 35 years, how significant he would be in my life forever. And I actually designed a class at Columbia called Traumatic Loss During Childhood, which looks at our losses over our entire life. Our losses don't have a beginning and an end. Now, that doesn't mean I don't have joy. I rebound very quickly when I think about my brother. I don't stay in these dark, sad places. I'm more in a joyful, celebratory way with him now. But I have conversations in my head with him. I think about him. I make decisions based on the fact that he was once in my life. He has had such a profound impact, and he still does to this day. And I didn't realize that he would be such a big part of my life and what I've done with my life for this long. And he will be forever until I'm not here anymore.
Wow, so beautiful.
So I think that's changed. I used to think, it takes a year to get over your loss. And none of that I believe in anymore. Because like I said, you don't get over it. And the whole idea of a year is absurd. I'll miss him as long as I'm here.
So Heidi, what would you say to someone who, let's say they had a loss 5-10 years ago, or I don't know, maybe even more, a couple decades ago, and they have not been able to get over it? How would you approach the conversation and situation? And where do you think, what do you think is happening in that situation? Like you mentioned that some people just never get over it, but I guess how can you help people move through something that took place many decades ago, but it still feels like it's happening in the present moment?
So 2 things. I don't want them to get over it, but I want them to learn to live with it. I definitely need them to learn to live with it. And if it keeps happening, what happens to us, that's a problem. So if you feel like when you think about the person that's died, that it's happening all over again and it feels very new, then you can be stuck in the trauma narrative. And so we have to remind ourselves when we're thinking about the person, and if we're thinking about the way that they died, etc., that's not happening anymore. We're in safe places, we're in supportive places, we're not in that space anymore. But I would say if you keep moving into those areas. And if it's creating situations where you can't function at work, where you're constantly thinking about it, where you're avoiding places that remind you of the person that died, where you're not functioning well anymore, where you're not, you're distancing yourself from people, you're isolating, then I would want to look at the possibility that it's complicated grief. And there is a Complicated Grief Institute, and there are, people on the internet that work with complicated grief. I would be careful about going into that too fast, because I don't want to label people as having complicated grief. But if it's been 20 years and you're functioning as if it just happened, I would look into some professional counseling around that, because it shouldn't feel like it's just happening at this point.
Right.
Like I am not in the same space I used to be in at all. If I didn't see hope, and if I didn't have joy, and if I didn't have positive experiences in my life today, I couldn't do the work I'm doing.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you, Heidi. And what have you found in the data of families who have dealt with major loss and trauma? How have you seen it impact their lives?
It can impact their lives in several ways. One is the family can get a lot closer because they realize that life is fleeting and, that people die. And so, as long as we can take for granted that people are always going to be in our lives. So I've seen it bring families very close. It brought my family closer. My sisters and I are best friends, and our only brother died. I've also seen the opposite. I've seen a family member that played a significant role for some reason leaving, and it tearing the family apart for whatever reason. It could be over money. It could be over the fact that the person that died was the family mediator. So I've seen both situations in families.
Heidi, is there anyone in this world who you kind of look up to as a mentor? Are there any books or resources that may have inspired you on this journey and on this path that could also be helpful for folks?
The two books that helped me the most are Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, How to Find Meaning. And there's one called The Empty Room, Losing a Brother or Sister at Any Age by Elizabeth DeVita Rayburn. It is an excellent sibling loss book. And there's actually a third one. There is a brand new book out called The Sixth Stage of Grief, Meaning Making. And it's by David Kessler. Those are the three books I think that have had the biggest impact on my life.
Oh, great. Yeah, I've heard of David Kessler's work, and I have not.
He's wonderful.
Yeah, I've not read it yet, but okay, cool. And what do you want to tell our listeners as your kind of main takeaway, your call to action on their well-being and wellness and how to take care of themselves during a time of grief? What would you say is your main takeaway, Heidi?
I would say, I have a bunch of them, but I would say have grace with yourself. Don't judge yourself too harshly. Tell yourself what you would tell a friend, because sometimes we're our own worst critics. Why am I in bed? Why am I not doing things? Why am I this? Why am I that? Be gentle with yourself. If you can exercise, even if it's just 10 minutes of walking a day, grief gets trapped in our bodies. And we need to move our bodies when we've had a loss. Not just talking, but we need to move our bodies. So if you can do yoga or walking or any kind of exercise, that's helpful. Eating healthy is helpful. Drinking a lot of water is helpful. And not isolating, reaching out to others for support.
Amazing. And lastly, why do you think that this subject is important?
Because whether or not you like this subject or not, most of us are going to have a death. It's just part of life. And we are going to have a death, and we're going to have to learn how to deal with the loss. And we're going to need to learn how to transform ourselves in a way, recreate ourselves, be in our next chapter, find meaning again, find hope again. It's a journey and it takes time. And, you might have 2 steps forward and feel, oh, I'm doing really well. This is great. Okay. I'm in a good place. And then all of a sudden you'll have a really bad day or a really bad hour and you'll be like, what happened? That's part of the journey. So being really good to yourself at this point, I think is key. And there is hope again. There is hope after loss. I want people to believe in that. I'm not in the same place I was in, at the beginning. I'm in a good place now. I'm in a positive place. I'm in a, I rebound quickly. The pain is no longer there. I think sometimes when we think about the pain and when we get into the pain, that's moving into the way that they died. If we want to connect with them, connect with the love and the joy and the hope. That's connecting with them.
What about if someone died and you were not on good terms with them? How do you, how would you approach that differently?
That's one of the hardest things. And I will tell you, with sibling loss, it's common because we have complicated relationships with our siblings. We try, they're safe people. We try, and our family members are safe people. So we try on lots of roles with them. It's safe. If I didn't care about you, I wouldn't even argue with you. I wouldn't give you any energy. So one of the things that I've learned over the years is that some of the people that have ambivalent, difficult relationships have the hardest time with their grief, and sometimes have the most grief. And sometimes we don't know how close we were until people have died. And then we're like, wow, they meant more to me than I realized, because now they're no longer here. So I would say there's things that you can do even after death to mend the relationship. And again, it's things like writing letters, writing to them, and then having them pretend to write back to you, and having conversations. They might be verbal, they might be in writing. You can mend the relationship even in death.
Beautiful, beautiful, Heidi. Thank you so much. Are there any resources that you can point folks to in order to learn more about you and your work and your books?
Go to opentohope.com. That's opentohope.com. And you will see all of our resources. And everybody that we've interviewed has had a loss. They have found hope. They are very candid about how they've done it. And like I said, we have 400 authors that are writing daily about the kind of topics, Yasmin, that we talked about today.
Amazing, amazing. Wow. What an incredible amount of resources for everyone who's listening. Heidi, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for doing this type of work. It's just so badly needed, especially now. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me on, and thank you for the conversation. Because you're normalizing this topic and this conversation, and we need more podcasts like this. So thank you, Yasmin.
Oh, thank you so much, Heidi. And for our audience, thanks for joining and for listening. In this episode, we learned about the grief process and how we can recover with Dr. Heidi Horsley. And you can tune in to Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, and spirituality. Thanks again.